Hello, end credits editors, and welcome to Circuit Court Entertainment, where we examine how laws and history affect all forms of media. I'm your host, Mina, and today we are looking at something tucked into the end credits of almost every single movie. No, not the copyright notice. It's this story, all names, characters, and incidents portrayed in this production are fictitious. No identification with actual persons, living or deceased, places, buildings, and products is intended or should be inferred, disclaimer. And sure, that makes sense on something like The Dark Crystal, which is very much fictional, or maybe even stuff like the MCU, where real-life history can have an effect on how the story will play out. See how Spider-Man 1 was edited after September 11th. But this disclaimer can also be seen on movies like biopics, where yes, we know the people involved are real. Abraham Lincoln is famously a real person. Why did you put it there? Well, the story is not that long, but the ripple effects are. In 1932, MGM released a movie called Rasputin and the Princess. It was intended as a big production. In fact, they hired the three Barrymore siblings, John, Ethel, and Lionel, to play Prince, the Tsarina, and Rasputin, respectively, and reportedly had a high budget. I say reportedly, as I mentioned during the Kong episode, no one was really publishing these numbers back then. It ended up getting nominated for Best Story at the 6th Academy Awards, and more importantly, stirred up some controversy. Because you see, they got sued. Part of the movie involves Rasputin hypnotizing one of the princesses and then assaulting her. While she did not bear the true name of her historical royal counterpart, the movie was released roughly 15 years after the fall of the Russian Empire, and therefore some people were still alive. Namely, the assassin of Rasputin and his wife, the Princess Irina, who was clearly supposed to parallel the Princess Rasputin assaulted in the movie, who was not played by one of the Barrymore siblings since, well, their big promotion was in how the siblings would be acting together, and it's a weird scene for siblings to play. Also, by all accounts, the scene was just made up for the movie. No historical research or biography says anything like that happened to the Princess Irina. Now, the assassin of Rasputin, and I'm forewarning, I will mispronounce pretty much all the names in this episode, Felix Yusupov, couldn't sue on his own behalf. He had bragged about what he had done. But, well, Princess Irina was a different matter. Princess Irina had never had that happen to her, and since she was still alive, there was a real issue of defamation that could happen. Defamation is a statement that injures someone's reputation, and the way the movie was framed, people could think Rasputin did assault her like that. So they sued MGM, and won. The offending footage was removed, destroyed, and is now considered lost media. And after that, movies have stuck with this disclaimer, and variations of it. Some humorous and others a bit more serious. For example, supernatural movies may include living or undead in the disclaimer, while Dragnet insisted that the crimes are real, but the names had been changed. However, it's not really as foolproof as it initially seemed. In a different situation, the 1980 movie The Idolmaker was sued by Fabian, an idol of the 50s and 60s. The movie detailed a music producer's handling of two musicians, Tommy and Cesar. Tommy was a singer with a talent and a career until he blew it, and Cesar was more of a model that Vinny, the producer, picked up to get back at Tommy. The music producer was based on Bob Marcucci, who was the creative lead on the movie, and Marcucci was Fabian's producer. Fabian argued that it was really obvious that Cesar was meant as a Fabian analog, with Tommy as an analog to Marcucci's previous talent, a man named Frankie Avalon, who left the business right before Marcucci found Fabian Forte. The movie implied Fabian wasn't a good singer and was basically just a pretty face. Forte, who did say he was hired initially due to being a pretty face and admitting before Congress that his voice was altered while Congress investigated payola, a whole other episode, he in fact had at least 10 top 100 songs and albums that hit top 15. He played on American Bandstand, a music on TV program at the time, and left the business of his own will. He moved on to acting, partially due to how Marcucci treated him, though he never reached the heights of his singing career. Despite this, the film studio and Forte settled out of court, but he and his wife got apologies and a percentage of the profits. While the movies did decent enough to have a remake announced, there does not seem to be any movement on that front. In 2013, the movie Captain Phillips released. Based on a 2009 incident of a pirate crew hijacking a shipping cargo vessel, the movie was a moderate success with $220 million on a budget of $55 million. Adjusted for inflation, it's about 1.5 times as much as Sahara. It was also sued by the crew of the real-life ship. Just because the disclaimer was on there didn't actually protect them against crew members claiming the movie overly sanctified Phillips and that the incident was at least partially his fault, namely by ignoring multiple warnings that pirates were likely to raid the boat and had raided other ships in the area. The movie was based on Phillips' book, so there would have been some bias. And that's just how it is with humans. But that is a difference between bias and lying. Unfortunately, I cannot find the entire results of the case, but it was resolved in the crew's favor. I also found out there are certain laws just for protecting maritime merchants, which is pretty cool, honestly. They are called the Jones Act or the Maritime Merchants Act of 1920. In my research, I found they're also mostly useless, with the slow decrease of the merchant marine class and how internal politics and country lines have changed since the 1920s, rendering this one of the few times when the laws actually were invoked. In any case, the lawsuit has dogged both the movie and Captain Phillips. According to the lawyers who took on the case, the company was found guilty in a seated judgment, and when Phillips gives interviews are similar, and stories about the court case do come up. In Persona 5, released in 2016, you have to sign an agreement saying everything in there is fake before starting the game. It's because, apparently, the people you target as phantom thieves in the game are thinly veiled counterparts to real people in scandals in Japan. Kamoshida, the first villain, bears a striking similarity to two Japanese high school coaches. One a gold medalist, Masato Yoshiba, who was abusing the girls on the judo team, much like how the fictional Kamoshida, his gold medal, and his girls' volleyball team. And another coach, Hajime Komura, who was beating up and abusing members of his team, much like how the Persona 5 character Ruiji was beaten by Kamoshida to the point where his leg is broken and did not properly set, making him unable to compete in running ever again. Soon the heroes have to face a Yakuza-style gang blackmailing them with fake photos. No specific gangs were found in my research, but the scam is simple and easy enough that I wouldn't be surprised. A later villain, Okumura, is matched up not with any particular company, but instead with Japan's crunch culture. People died to exhaustion at work, and even the Phantom Thieves barely managed to do any real changes. It's too ingrained in society. This ends up climaxing with the thieves facing off against Prime Minister Shido, a thinly veiled metaphor for then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, especially with how similar their goals were for returning Japan to its old glory, and their promotional posters being similar. The fact of the matter is, this disclaimer doesn't actually save anyone. It's a placebo. I can't comment on Japanese law related to the Persona 5 incidents, but at least in the US law, it doesn't appear to have helped anyone escape being sued. And it's also downright useless when it comes to movies that are blatantly fictional. I just saw Spider-Man 2, and while the only real thing in there is the apartment owner, the banker, and May's financial issues, who's going to claim Doc Ock was based on them? Especially when in the comics, he's even worse. But like many legal things, the act of having it there helps defend them in the fringe cases. Cases where the similarities are too generic or not something the writers would have known about. And that keeps it from being dragged out into court. Thank you for listening to Circuit Court Entertainment. If you found this episode interesting, please tell others as this is a new podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review on all the major podcast services. You can find me on Twitter at CCEPod and Tumblr at Circuit Court Entertainment. This episode was written, edited, and recorded by me, Mina. The script was edited by CJ Peterson. Podcast art by Empress Cirque on Twitter. Thank you for your time, and I hope to hear from you soon.